Morning everyone, and welcome to the We Value Nature 10-day challenge Midway Plenary. Thanks very much for coming. My name is Paul, I'm from Opla. It's going to be a quick sort of kitchen table session this morning. We're halfway through the challenge. We've got some really good stats on how it's all going. Hopefully you've been enjoying the sessions you've attended. I know myself and the team have. Just a quick catch up really at the midpoint. We wanted to look at some of the outcomes from the challenges that we've been running each day. Look at some of the key takeaways from some of the sessions, you know, what's been happening, what have been the key points, and have a little look forward to the second half of the 10-day challenge as well. We've had 45 sessions set up as part of the 10-day challenge. I think about 18 of those are completed, so we are just about at the halfway point. We've had 1,500 people attend the challenges so far, which is really great, really good number. We'll look at some of the stats from that a bit later on. 300 or more daily challenges completed. So thanks for those of you who've had the energy and have been participating on all of that so far. We've had lots of interesting sessions, training sessions, technical sessions, discussion. Thankfully, no arguments, I think, so far that I'm aware of, so it all seems to be going well. And please be active on Hivebright as well and on social media. So just to kick off this morning, we've got Nadine McCormick, who's an old friend from now at WBCSD, World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where she's the manager of Nature Action. Nadine was with us for the start of the We Value Nature journey at the beginning of the campaign, so we thought it would be fair to bring her in at this point and to talk a little bit about We Value Nature, where we came from, what was the thinking behind We Value Nature itself, what was the journey that we wanted to go on, and talk a little bit about that. So I'll hand over to Nadine for the next 10 minutes. We've got some panel discussion today. I'll introduce the panel a bit later on. Thanks, Nadine.
Super. Thanks, Paul. And really thank you for the invitation. And say you never really leave IUCN, you never really leave the We Value Nature campaign, right? So really happy to be here. I am, and happy as well for the topic that I was asked to present as well. So, okay, the title is not so very sexy, the theory behind We Value Nature, but I think by the end of these 10 minutes that I have with you, I hope I'm going to convince people that are on the call today and then others who are going to be listening later that the theory really based on change management is really critical for whatever sustainable practices we want to put in place, whether, you know, it's in your company, the network of companies that you're working with, or even in your family. So why a change management approach? As Paul said, this kind of really emerged at some of those first We Value Nature project meetings. We wanted to define for ourselves what success looked like in terms of uptake of natural capital approaches, or when we said new norm for valuing nature. And so both of these actually refer to a behavior change. And so while the technical side of understanding and quantifying impacts and dependencies is super important, as the Harvard Business Review argues, for successful change processes, the process side is equally important as the technical side. So we can't forget that. Indeed, the evidence that they talk about suggests that about 30% of general corporate change initiatives are successful. Only 30. And so given the ecological crisis that we're all in, we don't have time for such failure rates. The good news, though, is that initiatives that focus on change management are 6 times more likely to meet their objectives. And so just as this little cartoon shows, yes, we often do our situation analysis, we know where we are, we know where we want to go, and then that miracle part in the middle, we just kind of hope it's going to happen. No, what I'm suggesting today is having a really focused, deliberate interventions based on the level of change that we're looking at. So successful change, what does it mean in practice? So this graphic is adapted from Prosky, which is one of the leading corporate change management specialists used by most Fortune 500 companies. And so it shows that change interventions need to be considered not just at the company level, so that organization level, we often talk about changing business practices, but really it breaks it down also at the at the project level. So let's say that's a product or a site, and the individual level. And then actually, if we're going to try to then also get change at scale, we need to consider sectors as well. So any initiative to get companies to change their practices needs to have a consideration of all 4 of those levels, and then tailor the approach accordingly. And for me, I think the individual one is the most important one, because actually, if you think about it, all systems, all companies are ultimately just made up of individuals making decisions every day, and we need to intervene also at that level. And so I think you on the call today, you are our natural capital champions. You are here because you're interested, and we need to equip you to be, effective change makers in your respective networks. And so to do that, I think one of the important next messages would be to say that then change doesn't happen all at once. And so again, from Prosky, they've identified, this beautiful little arrow diagram, which I use all the time, which on the top level talks about the stages of change at the individual, the people side of change. And then on the bottom is the organizational side of change. And those of you who I've had met in the past before know one of my favorite acronyms is ADKAR. And so you're going to know this off by heart by the end of the session today. And so ADKAR really is one takeaway I want you to have in mind. It represents an acronym for the steps of successful change. So awareness of the change, desire or willingness to make the change, knowledge to be able to make the change, and then the ability, which is like the means of the resources, and then importantly, the reinforcement. So then you just don't go back to the old system. And so then it's really important to be thinking about like any change that you've got in mind. So let's say you want your company to consider impacts and dependencies on nature in their sourcing decisions. If you come along with a big, a guidance document or a training course on, how we're going to do this, but you haven't talked about, well, what the issues are and why they're important, then you're going to lose people along the way. So basically, there are logical sequenced steps to take. And if you can understand where the individuals are that you're targeting on their journey, then you can tailor them accordingly. And as I said earlier, this doesn't just work, in a company context. This works with your family and your partners as well. So always be thinking, how aware of the change are they? Do they want to make the change before then you come about how to actually make it? So we've adopted this ADKAR type approach into our theory of change for the We Value Nature campaign. So you will recognize some of the words here now. And this is where we talk about this journey of natural capital. So simply being, aware of nature and why natural capital is important, that wanting to, make natural capital into decision making, that's really at that individual level. And then as you get to the project level, let's say a site, then you're actually, well, then now how do I do it? How do I apply natural capital thinking to understand our impacts and dependencies in this particular location? And then as you roll it up through the company, then you're then looking at changing policies to then change other behaviors at scale, and then ultimately, getting to the sector level as well, because of course, some changes, they have to be reflected along the value chain as well. And so the We Value Nature campaign, it's one simple arrow, but actually there's a very detailed theory of change behind this, which shows that we target our interventions accordingly. And so at the beginning, we have some very simple introductory training materials. Later on, then we have more guidance on actually going deeper into natural capital assessments and communication materials to support those as well. I think the final insight that I'd like to share with you today that's come from the We Value Nature campaign is this notion of barriers. So you see this a lot in systems thinking as well. What are the barriers and levers that we have for uptake of natural capital thinking? So we built on work from the annual survey that the former Natural Capitals Coalition would send to its members, and just understanding, what are your biggest barriers right now? So this is really tiny, but you can see often, the perception that it's complex, or I don't understand the benefits, would come up really highly. And we also mirrored that with the survey that the We Value Nature campaign did to launch the campaign. But I think what's interesting is actually then breaking it down and then actually seeing that some of those barriers really relate to that individual level at the beginning. Some of them relate to then the project level of, okay, well, how do I do an assessment? Where do I get data from? And then actually, as you try to roll it out through the company, then institutional inertia kicks in, this dominance of single issues like plastics or climate change, and then ultimately, lack of regulatory frameworks to kind of get to scale. And so what we've had great fun actually is putting together a new resource, which is going to be released by the end of the We Value Nature campaign, which we're kind of affectionately calling the mountains infographic. But it won't just be an infographic, it will be a very interactive tool that you can use to navigate your way through this natural capital journey. So if we kind of depicted the peak of the mountain of, where we're all trying to go, our North Star, as a place where we've got integrated values, nature, human, social, other capitals, so that companies are contributing to net positive, adding back more than they take. So if that's where we're going, there's no single path to get there, is the first message from this. Regardless of where you go, though, you still see those typical barriers at similar stages of the journey. So, just be aware of where you are on your journey. Think about which of these little characters you are, and you'll be able to zoom in on this infographic when it's available and see, oh yeah, that's me. And then here are some barriers, and then we'll guide you, we'll give you some indication of what resources you can use to overcome those barriers. And so what we've asked you throughout the 10-day challenge, when you're registering for different sessions, you'll always see a question, where are you on your journey? And we're asking that deliberately because we want to also tailor what we're saying to your needs. It's not too late to fill in these challenges as well. So you can sign up for the 10-day challenge. One of the first questions actually is reflect, where are you on your journey and what are your barriers right now? So if you haven't signed up for that yet, please do. And I hope somebody will share in the chat box where you can do that. And so then let's say for the next slide, so you're just starting on your journey. And so here, we should just say already, congratulations, like you've just taken the first step. It's great, that you've already started on this journey. The next level, then you'd see we call like first steps. We've taken this from the Capitals Coalition too. So first steps, kind of aware of natural capital. I'm interested to learn more. So your barriers are typically more individual. You think it's complex. You don't really understand the benefits. So there's, somebody like sitting on a rock, scratching their head, and somebody else has got a question mark over their head. And so what we do here then is we've got this very introductory training module on the links between nature and business. So that can be tailored into a 1-hour introductory session or a whole day, depending on the buy-in that you have already, and some really simple curated materials through the media library. And then as you go further up the journey, so then you say, right, okay, I need to do my first assessment. Like we heard them from the first day. What's that one action you can take right now? Do your assessment. Oh, but are there any case studies that can help me do that? Where do I get the data from? So then this is more at that project level. So that's where we've got a dedicated training session on scoping out a first natural capital assessment. We're pulling together some testimonial case studies. So not just the glossy successes, but really also, the practical details and the challenges as well. So they're being rolled out along the campaign. And then of course, you're going to get hit by the institutional inertia piece or sustaining momentum. That's really where like, well, I get it, but then how do I get my other colleagues, to come along with me? And so actually a shameless plug, we have a whole session on that Monday afternoon, where we'll break down what this institutional inertia barrier looks like at both an individual and the company level as well. So I'll put a link in the chat box afterwards. And then finally, as you kind of go up, then you start seeing the barriers are more, at the organizational level, lack of the standards, the silos, and then trying to get to that fully integrated step at the end, where you need like the regulatory frameworks. And so the We by Nature is doing some pieces around aligning policy, for example, again, working with other projects that are working on that. So really, that's kind of a whirlwind tour of, this journey of natural capital, how the barriers show up differently depending on where you are and where the people that you're trying to change their behaviors are. So really my final plea, I guess, is just to kind of think about, where are you? And then how would you tailor your interventions? Don't just come along with a big, thick guidance document if you haven't raised, awareness and buy-in for the issue already. And then, but just to say, enjoy the rest of the 10-day challenge. Do sign up for the challenges. I'm looking forward to hearing some of the results that have come out now already from some of the earliest people that have signed up. And then see you on Monday. So thanks very much. Cheers, Paul.
Thanks very much, Nadine. That's great. Yeah, it's. I find it really enlightening, actually. This kind of approach that I know you worked to set out early on in the project. I love the idea as well that you have to be sort of agile. There's more than one route at the mountain, and I think in work we tend to get sort of stuck in. We sort of plough that one furrow sometimes, and I think that's going to get us to the destination that we want to arrive at. When actually, you sometimes have to be agile along the way. And we'll have that mountain graphic available for everyone quite soon. Just to reassure everyone, it doesn't get colder and lack of oxygen the higher you get to success, by the way. It's actually the opposite. It gets warmer and more energizing. But
and the view is amazing.
And the view is great. Yeah,
there's so many ways we can take this analogy.
Thanks very much, Nadine. We'll come back to Nadine in a moment. This leads nicely on to a couple of the challenges that we ran earlier in the 10-day challenge. I can ask my colleague James just to bring up a few slides. because we asked those of you involved in the challenge, where are you on your natural capital journey, and what are some of the barriers that you're facing? So here are some of the results. So I thought this was quite interesting. So as we wanted, actually, lots of the people who are engaging in the challenge are taking their first steps. And I think that's really important, because the whole aim of this 10-day challenge campaign was to really bring new people into this space and help get more people started on those first steps on their journey. So I think that's a really promising result to see there. Interesting, we've got sort of a similar amount of people towards who have a more mature experience, who are a bit further down the line. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting. So hopefully we've got lots of people who've learned something as a result of this challenge already, but I thought that was good to see. And the next slide, please, James. And then we also asked people which are the most common barriers that they tend to face. And keep in mind the result from the previous slide, that a lot of the people are on their first stages. Again, I thought it's quite interesting to see this sort of, people want to see sort of a standardized approach and sort of a lack of regulatory frameworks. So it's that sort of standard fit that seems to be something that people notice as a barrier. Institutional inertia, I thought, just down at the bottom there, doesn't seem to be, I expected that to be higher, actually. We can maybe talk about that in a moment. Maybe that's a good thing to see. Quite commonly that can be cited, I think, when you talk to businesses. How can I persuade my colleagues, possibly line manager in some cases, that this is a good journey to start on. We'll just keep those on screen for a moment. Just to intervene as well, if any of you want to raise points in the chat, I know some of you are doing so already, we've got some information there, that's great. Also use the Q&A function when we come to that. We're going to move into a panel session next and have a bit of a discussion. But yeah, I thought those were, I just think it's really promising that we're obviously engaging with some of these new people who are new on the natural capital journey.
I can come in, Paul, actually. I mean, with the slide that I showed some of the results from the 2016-2017 survey from the Natural Capitals Coalition, as it was then, and then also what we saw from our survey when we launched Revalue Nature, what you're seeing is a general maturity overall on natural capital. So before, it was always natural capital is complex, I don't understand the benefits as the top ones. And now actually we're seeing that transition, now that we're seeing, well, actually, how do we do it? There's no standardized approach. And then what about the regulatory framework to kind of help get this through? Yeah. So actually, I see this as a good sign of the maturing of the natural capital movement.
Yeah, I agree. And those of you who work in communications and perhaps work in a role where you're trying to encourage businesses to act more sustainably, I think identifying those that are sort of on the cusp of taking that step but haven't quite yet done it, floating voters, if you want to call them that, are a really good audience to push at, because they sometimes, don't need too much resource to sort of get them started, but I think they do need some support. We're going to move into a bit of a panel chat, and also I'm going to invite those of you in the audience here as well to put some questions to the panel. And the first topic we wanted to talk about was, what barriers have you faced on your natural capital journeys, or what barriers are you aware of that your clients or your customers or your partners have faced? And what have you done to overcome those? And those can, of course, be barriers that you're facing at the moment. It doesn't have to be things that you've necessarily overcome. So just to put that question to everyone here, use the Q&A function to pose your questions. You can put them in the chat as well, but it's easier for me to manage if they're in the Q&A. And just to introduce our panel, so with us today, we've got Mark Gough from Capitals Coalition. We've got Nadine, who you've just seen, Nadine McCormick from WBCSD. We've got Julia Marino from Foretica. We've got Guy Duke from ICAEW, who's the We Value Nature project lead. We've also got members of the We Value Nature project team here as well, so you'll be hearing some others speak a bit later on. Just whilst we wait for some questions to come in, just to put it to the panel, when you looked at the results that we received from the challenge participants on the challenges that they were facing, you had sort of lack of sort of policy framework or standards at the top, and institutional inertia at the bottom. What was your sort of feeling on that? Did that picture look as you expected it? Now, I'll maybe put that to Mark to start with.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it did look like how I expected it. And obviously, we've got one of the last sessions we're doing as the We Value Nature campaign this week, the 10-day challenge, is going to be on that topic, on that standards. So do join if you're around at 2 o'clock CET on the last day, on the 24th, where we're going to be bringing together some of those that are looking at standardization at the moment to start thinking through that problem. And there is a lot of work going on standardization at the moment as well. We've just had the UN SEER last week. Everyone will be aware of this. That has now become a standard. So at a government level, a national level, we've now got a standard set of classifications and asset classes. So we are starting to get that at a government level. And at a business level, the EU has 2 projects which are running at the moment. One is called Transparent, which is looking at the broader natural capital aspects, and we'll be having the first set of methodologies coming out of that quite soon. And that's including the Value Balancing Alliance, which some of you may have heard of, and WBCSD again in there, and the Capitals Coalition. And then there's the Align project, which is specifically looking at biodiversity, which is a bit more of a tricky problem. There's been over 19 different approaches, new metrics developed in the last couple of years on biodiversity. We've been through a plethora of things, which I think links through to your first slide that you were showing, that there's lots of people coming into this space. That's great, but we're at the flowers blooming bit. Now what we do need to do is now start consolidating again, a bit like an accordion. In 2015, the 40 different approaches that were there, a lot of the people here on the line today helped to bring those together into the Natural Capital Protocol, which is an overarching framework. Now what we're doing is we're really digging into that and standardizing different steps of that process. So yeah, I think that the signs that were coming through there are very, very clear that actually we're in the right time, but there's a lot of work going on for people to get involved with.
Thanks, Mark. We've got a question just coming from Sybil Riedmiller. Sorry, Sybil, if I've got your surname wrong there, which relates to that, Mark. So maybe I'll put this to you as well, and then I'm going to invite Julia to come in. So Sybil's saying that regulatory frameworks and policies are needed to incentivize business and to avoid a competitive disadvantage in the market. You've got any thoughts on that, Mark?
Yes, well, we run lots of different workshops. You know, at the Coalition, we've got science and academia, so all the best stuff that's going on at the moment. We've got lots of business, finance, governments all in there. Every single one of them asks for something slightly different and blames someone else in the circle. So we often hear the call for more regulation. I think the chance that regulation is going to really step forward has been increased through COVID, actually. We're doing a lot around green recovery. We're doing a lot, there's 5 countries now with well-being reports. They're actually starting to look at that, New Zealand being one of them. We've been working closely with the Environment Minister, Vicky Robertson, there more recently. So I think that there will be more regulation, but I don't think we should wait for it. And I think that's where We Value Nature really comes in, to make sure you're prepared to be able to pick up on that as things change. We've seen EFRAG, so I'm using lots of acronyms here, I'm sorry, but the reporting guidelines and approach is being taken in Europe. The IFRS, which is the standard body that sets all of this, is also looking at changes. So there will be regulation, but get ready for it. And that's why you need to work with We Value Nature.
Thanks, Mark.
If I could jump in there, Paul.
Of course.
I think it's worth mentioning also here, of course, the European Green Deal, which sets a new trajectory for the European Union in this regard, and will be followed by quite a number of regulatory initiatives to implement that, and that includes further action in relation to sustainable finance, financial reporting, natural capital accounting. So I think business can see this kind of transitional regulation coming down the line, and there's all the more reason, therefore, to be ahead of the game.
Thanks, Guy. I'm just going to bring in Julia for a second. Hi, Julia. When you saw the slide in terms of the typical barriers that some of our audience are facing, did that sort of fit the picture of your work with Foretica and the types of clients, types of organisations that you work with, and what are some of the barriers that you encounter from your work? Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I think it perfectly fits what we are seeing from companies here in Spain with where we work, and we are noticing that companies are finding difficulty on understanding what are the real dependencies and impacts on nature and on ecosystem services, because sometimes high impact sectors have that knowledge very integrated in their strategies or in their assessments, but some other companies like services or maybe assurance doesn't have that knowledge integrated. So that is one of the barriers, the knowledge and the ability to understand that they have to tackle with this issue. And there is also some experience related to the complexity that was one of the ideas that was also mentioned by Nadine. It's related to the wide range of tools that exist at the just to measure the impact on nature. The different ways of understanding that dependencies and impacts, and also economic valuing of also the nature and these dependencies. So maybe having a specific tool or a standardized tool that could help companies to get in this journey of natural capital. And of course, it was something that have already been mentioned, but I think it's nature is something that should be, as sustainability in general, should be something transversal to all the company, that should be considered by not only the environmental areas, but also marketing, finance, as we mentioned before, or even other areas that could be or should be incorporating these approaches. So yeah, I would mention these barriers, and we are seeing that companies in Spain are working very hard on this journey, and there are some companies that are more mature, but I think we are leaving a good momentum for nature, and companies are understanding that this is something that is more very related to the economic value of the company, and that climate change, for example, has always been in the agenda, but nature has always to be, and it's important that it has the same level of importance. Yeah.
Thank you, Julia. That's a good point. I think it links to what Nadine was saying as well about the, by setting out this sort of the different stages of the journey as we do, I think it avoids companies sort of worrying that they have to be towards the success end right at the start, that it is a journey. It's not just something you switch on and suddenly you're a green business. It's a process. Yeah. And I think that can be reassuring for people. And as you say, companies at lots of different stages, I think. Yeah. Just one thing that I know has been on my mind recently, in everyone's mind, is the situation with COVID. I know it gets talked about a lot and it might be going over old ground. And this is for all the panel really, but do we think this current situation we're living in at the moment, is this a barrier, or is this actually an opportunity that's being presented here? I know some businesses are, having to reprioritize in response to the COVID situation, and perhaps revert back to, what we might call old-fashioned ways of running business because they feel security there. But also with businesses restructuring and rethinking things, is this an opportunity to inject some of that new thinking into their decision making, at this point? What do our panel feel on that? I'll come back to Mark and we'll work through.
I was going to say I'd like to hear from Susanna on this, actually, about, because we've had this before, haven't we? 2008 financial crash. We all got very hopeful that was going to be a moment of change. It didn't happen, did it? I am more hopeful this time, and the reason is because we are getting an awful lot more people actually approaching us about this. You saw there, most of the people involved so far have been new people to this topic. There's a lot of people sitting there thinking, how can we come back, build back better? How can we look at this and actually start changing? there's also all of these other drivers as well. And I love Nadine's thing about that miracle moment, you know, the David Attenborough on the beach with a turtle and a straw up its nose that happened with plastics. 25, 30 years of science and all of that working. And then it took that moment to actually tip it over into something really significant. And it feels like at the moment in the conversations we're having that you are getting systemic change. The food systems work we're doing in Indonesia, Thailand, Mexico, Brazil, China, all of that work at the moment, we're getting massive numbers of organizations actually wanting to get involved in this process. So to me, I think this is an opportunity, but I'd love to hear Susanna's thoughts, like I say, from 2008.
Sorry, Susanna, just before you jump in, just to say a quick goodbye to Nadine, because she's got to dash off for another meeting. And thanks very much, Nadine, for joining us this morning. Sorry, Susanna, please continue.
Thank you. Well, absolutely. I work in financial services, and I think the change that we have seen over the last year has been quite incredible. And this is really coming from asset managers and asset owners, and the actual investor push that has changed everything. And I think it really gives us a way in. I would say the actual investor push is really for ESG compliant investments. And COVID is the one that really put S to the front of everything and the social effects. But by looking at ESG, more and more institutions realize that the E actually involves and includes a lot more than climate. And once you start thinking about that, what else is in that E, looking at biodiversity, water, waste, and all other elements and components of nature, it is actually quite an eye-opener. The number of conversations I've had with financial services institutions, I would say it's really encouraging, definitely.
We could also point to, if I may come in there, just to add, some of you who were on the opening plenary might have recalled hearing Ian Cheshire, who until recently was the chair of Barclays UK, saying that they're about to embark on a biodiversity assessment of their portfolio, their entire portfolio. And we know that one or two banks in the Netherlands have also done this. So the finance sector is certainly beginning to take a closer look at the extent of their exposure and indeed the extent of the opportunity. So I think the other thing, for coming back to COVID, I think the other thing possibly that the pandemic has raised awareness about is the value of good science and the value of evidence. Suddenly politicians and the general public are realizing that evidence-based decision-making is so important. And I think this bodes well also for the environment. We noted in some of the statistics that Paul showed at the beginning that data and science evidence is one of the barriers, and I know companies are always keen to point to that as a barrier and perhaps something that stops them from moving forward. But I do think it's valid, and I do think there's a lot to be done, even in the unglamorous task of monitoring the environment. It's always the underfunded, poor relative. But it's so important if you're really going to get a handle on what works and what doesn't work.
Thanks, Guy. It's a really good point. And we need that evidence, don't we, to convince people as well. I think that's really important. Thanks, Susanna. Thanks, Guy. Richard, you've got a hand up. And then after Richard, we'll move on to the next session just to keep on time.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say that I thought was interesting was the institutional inertia had dropped down that list so far. And actually, reflecting on it, it shouldn't surprise me, because then I think if we were to look at our membership 13 months ago, there would have been some engagement and some recognition of the importance of the things we're talking about. Today, that's just completely changed. In just a couple of examples. One is in January, we launched a sustainability and climate change community amongst our membership. And we were budgeting to gain 3,000 members really in the first year. We're already at 8,000. And the push from our members now for continuing professional development around this, I'm now working with our learning professional development department, with our members department, just because there's just so much more demand for this. It's different, you know, and I think we're still in the big ambition place, and we've got to see that translation of ambition into action, but we're starting to see some of that. So I'm you know, you think about how conservative our membership tends to be, chartered accountants. I think this change signals quite a substantial shift in the mind of the business community. And, you know, our members aren't just auditors. There are 60% of our membership are members who are in business, running businesses.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, that ambition to action thing is one of the points we're going to come on to next. So that's a great link. Thanks very much. Just before we move on, there's a good question raised by Philip Mitchell around, can we share examples of companies or whole industries using public engagement with their customers and stakeholders as part of their change management? We have got some examples on that, Philip. We're also working on some testimonial videos where we're going out speaking to companies around Europe, and we're going to be creating a series of short films that will be made available through Creative Commons license, so you can use some clips of those films in your own materials. So yeah, we'll follow up with you on that. Thanks, Philip.
Paul, if I may perhaps quickly.
Of course, Jared, yeah.
Yeah, so what's interesting is, you know, when we look back at this week, you know, we didn't really know on where we were going to, but it has been fantastic. The uptake, the number of participants that we had, but also the myriad of different events that we've had. And that's so fascinating that we see that this space is very diverse. And to a certain extent, there are really these first steps, initial training sessions, but there are also games. There are also very deep conversations that are happening, perhaps in smaller groups. And then there are very inspirational speeches happening. So really, we encourage you to continue to be with us for the next 4 or 5 days as well, because all these questions that we've been tackling are inspired by all the inputs that you have provided. And also remember that all the sessions have been recorded. So there's a way for you to track back and listen back to some of these discussions. And just to answer Philip's questions briefly, what is very interesting, and that's where with the mountain we try to highlight this as well, is that there are different maturity levels when you're entering this space. And some sectors, and I'm looking at the extractives and the mining sector, they've embarked in this journey long time ago, because for them it was a business imperative. If they were not securing and doing properly their environmental impact assessment and understanding what their impact on the environment was, then there was no way that they could actually get a permit for the next mine, for the next extractive site. So they have actually practiced this much earlier because it was already in their regulatory framework. Now, a lot of people, when I talk to the food and ag sector, they say, why don't we get permits when we are doing land use changes? Because that could be another incentive for them to really, you know, decide on where to do things. But what is the wow effect for me out of the 10-day challenge is that the organizational inertia, as Richard was saying, has disappeared. It's now very down the line, which is fantastic, because that means you are now free and open and allowed and empowered to actually bring the nature topic into your company. And what I've noticed is that a lot of the sessions that we had were very much on how do we navigate this space? What's the navigation tool? What's the decision tree? What's this mountain path that we need to take? And there are brilliant sessions around there. There was one last night by Johan Lamarand from Arcadis that was showing this new navigation wheel. I know the coalition you know, has now launched the navigation tool that helps you selecting the right tools for that. But we have to go beyond this. We need now to get to actions. And that's where the other element comes in. And that's where there has been other sessions that are really focusing on nature-based solutions as well. So how can we address this with actions? Because the entry point might not always be through the conceptual thinking, but it might be bottom up from the actions that you can actually undertake. And that's where I think the pandemic and COVID-19 has really helped, because we realize this is a global crisis and we're all being affected by the pandemic in a different way. It's adapted to the context and where we are. And that's where also there's the solutions in addressing nature and the impact we have on nature, or the dependencies we have on nature, needs to be addressed and contextualized very locally. And that's where we need more exchanges, more examples and case studies from you, so that we can help the ones that don't know on how to start, how to get to the next step. Paul, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jared. That's great. We'll move on to the next session, I think, and that's a very good point, isn't it? And I think, you know, outside of the business world and outside of our professional lives, I think just as human beings, we've become, you know, much more aware of our relationship with nature and how important it is, and perhaps how we've, you know, homogenized, taken some of that for granted. So I know in other sectors of, you know, environmental work, there's this sort of rising awareness, I think, amongst the public that links with lots of other aspects around climate change and things like that. So I think it has boosted the movement to some extent. We're doing well for time, actually. We've got 5 minutes, so just to quickly look at some, I did promise we'd look at some key takeaway points from the session so far. James, I think we've got a slide for that. James, who I keep referencing, by the way, is my colleague who does all the technical stuff here. He's very under applauded because he doesn't get the limelight, but thanks, James. So these are just some points that we've picked up from the session so far. We're just going to very briefly, we'll probably get through 1 or 2 of these. I thought let's maybe, Julia, just to invite you to talk about possibly the 3rd point about, you know, it's great that people have got an ambition to make a commitment, but is that really sufficient for biodiversity? And how do we sort of, you know, turn, you know, ambition into action? How do we help companies make that next step? Maybe Julia, if I can invite you to say a few words on that.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, well, I think the strategies and goals are very important. It's a key thing, but because it helps us to understand what is our strategy, where are we going, and what are these goals that we need to achieve. But as Nadine was saying, there is not a miracle that is going to happen to stop biodiversity loss, to increase biodiversity rates globally. So we need to take action, and we need to overcome these barriers that we've been sharing, and understand from companies and also governments what are our dependencies and impacts on nature. We need to change the different processes that we have in our companies. We need to integrate nature in our decision-making processes, and also use different tools depending on our stakeholders, just to take action and make a change. And that's why nature-based solutions are a key thing. And also, for example, reporting or disclosure that, as you mentioned before, it's been also an important trend related to the disclosure on non-financial issues is also a key thing. So I think we have to move from commitment to action. Course, and that's the only way to overcome all of these barriers and take a step forward.
Thank you, Julia. We've probably got time for 1 more. Can I invite anyone from the panel to jump in if there's one of those that you really want to speak about? Otherwise, I'll perhaps pick one.
Can I just say, Paul, just very briefly, the institutional capacity at the end is interesting, because we said that institutionally we're getting further, but there's still a massive skills gap. I think that's really important. On the Hivebright, on the community website, which all of this work is going through, and please do go on there and continue the conversations after this. On there, one of the most useful things is the opportunities page, where we've got new projects coming up where you can go in and find out about, but also the skills and the knowledge gap. It's what Richard Spencer was mentioning earlier on about the ICAW. How do we train accountants? How do we make sure that there's all of that formal education, as well as all of that awareness that We Value Nature is doing? I think that skills gap is really still going to be a barrier as we're going forward. I'm aware of at least 20 jobs at the moment of people in the space. So if you want a profession that's going to go somewhere, move into the space of capitals, because there's an awful lot of need, particularly the financial institutions who pay very well, actually. So why don't you start thinking about that?
Thanks, Mark. That's really good advice. I've been saying the same to a few people as well. Actually, it's a good space to be working in.
And Paul, if I may, just very quickly, it's responding to the 4th bullet, but also reinforcing what Mark is saying, is that what's very interesting is that the biodiversity crisis was in competition somehow with the climate crisis. And to a certain extent, biodiversity or the conservation world was kind of jealous of the attention, especially the financial attention or the business attention that the climate crisis was getting. But the great news is that nature is actually a key solution for a lot of the climate elements as well. And these two crises really go hand in hand. So there's a lot to learn from the climate debate and from the climate crisis and all the efforts that has been there now on reporting and disclosure. And the nature debate is now learning from that and hopefully even, you know, leapfrogging it to a certain extent. And that's where we also see the marrying of nature climate solutions with nature-based solutions is the way forward. And the last element, I think, is that as the pandemic has shown us, huge changes are actually possible and very rapidly as well. And that's what we should really be embracing, that there is no resistance to change as long as you've made the right business case on why this change is needed. And we have had a lot of elements and arguments that are proving to us that nature needs to be, you know, conserved if we want to be able to live on this planet and being able to deliver something to our children and the next generations.
Thanks, Gerard. That's a really good point.
Paul, talking of which, I know you're trying to close, but the last session of this whole thing is the young people session. So really, really do get involved in that. What is the future? A couple of people running that. Have a look at that and get involved in that if you, particularly if you're under 30.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, our closing plenary, as Mark says, we've got a really good session there from people under 30 who've got some great ideas, certainly better ideas than I have. So that's a really good session to attend. We're going to wrap up with 1 minute over time, so I'm going to draw it to a close. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. Thanks to our panel as well. Our challenge today is actually to thank your colleagues and associates and those that you work with for their help and sort of, you know, to thank people in our own networks. So I'd just like to sincerely thank everyone I'm working with here. So that's my challenge done. Go and do yours. And also, please do continue the conversations over on the Capitals community. Over on Hivebright, there's some great discussion going on there, and that's a place to continue building this discussion after the 10-day challenge has ended as well. It's recently launched, the Capitals community, the new platform, so I'm finding it a really good space to look at. There's some good discussion going on there, so please do contribute there. Go and do your challenge today. I think we've got a session starting in just over 10 minutes, actually, one of our first sessions for today, so go and have a look at that. Thanks again to everyone who came. Thanks to the panel. And yeah, keep challenging. We've got another five days of this to go. It's going great so far, as Gerard mentioned. It's going better than expected, actually. So thanks to those of you who are keeping that momentum going. And yes, have a good day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Have a very good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.